Crystal Ball and Saagar Enjeti are the hosts of the relatively new but very popular show Rising on Hill TV. The show kind of reminds me of a reverse Hannity and Colmes from back in the day, where one of the hosts clearly has the upper hand and the other one sort of goes along as best as he can. In this case, Crystal is Hannity and Saagar is the sidekick, always seeking common ground rather than picking a fight. Recently, the two of them co-authored the book The Populist's Guide to 2020, A New Right and a New Left Are Rising. It has sold incredibly well. I just got mine in the mail a few days ago, and I've almost already finished it. It's a relatively short book of essays that are very similar to segments they do on the show. From what I can tell as of this recording, there is no cohesive narrative, aside from the basic populist shtick that elites, through some combination of malice, corruption, and ineptitude, are responsible for the problems of normal people. You don't have any responsibility over your own life, no. Just blame the politicians, and the media, and the billionaires, and the corporations, and whoever else is on the enemies list these days, and you're good. That's what populism is after all. It's the politics of an enemies list. So when I finish this book, if I can discern a cohesive narrative past that, I will do an actual review. Until then, I'll just stick with videos on specific essays. We'll start with this one by Saagar titled, Is Trade or Automation More to Blame for Manufacturing Job Loss? In this essay, Saagar recapped an exchange between Andrew Yang and Elizabeth Warren from the October Democratic debate. Yang was on his usual shtick, talking about the rise of automation and the need to accommodate people in a future where robots are responsible for most of our labor. After he finished, Elizabeth Warren said this.
Senator Warren, you wrote that blaming job loss on automation is, quote, a good story, except it's not really true. So should workers here in Ohio not be worried about losing their jobs to automation?
So the data show that we've had a lot of problems with losing jobs, but the principal reason has been bad trade policy. The principal reason has been a bunch of corporations, giant multinational corporations, who've been calling the shots on trade, giant multinational corporations that have no loyalty to America. They have no loyalty to American workers. They have no loyalty to American consumers. They have no loyalty to American communities. They are loyal only to their own bottom line. I have a plan to fix that, and it's accountable capitalism. It says you want to have one of the giant corporations in America, then by golly, 40% of your board of directors should be elected by your employees. That'll make a difference when a corporation decides, gee, we could save a nickel by moving a job to Mexico, when there are people on the board in the boardroom saying, no. Do you know what that does to our company? Do you know what that does to our community, to what it does to our workers? We also need to make it easier to join a union and give unions more power when they negotiate.
So who has the facts on their side? Well, according to Saagar, Warren is correct. He writes, this may shock you, but I actually think Elizabeth Warren is right. Bad trade policy is far more responsible for the loss of these 4 million manufacturing jobs than automation. Saagar narrowly focuses on manufacturing jobs since 2000, which is right around when China was granted permanent normal trade relations with the US. As evidence for his position, he cites Samuel Hammond, the director of poverty and welfare at the Niskanen Center, who claims that if it was automation that caused these job losses, we would see a spike in the growth rate of manufacturing productivity, which we haven't. And as far as I can tell, that's true. But here's the thing. If anyone had claimed that China shock wasn't a thing, or that there weren't issues with our trade relations with them, then Saagar would have a point. But, to my knowledge, no credible person has. Populists like Saagar have a tendency, whether deliberately or out of genuine belief, to play into people's worst anxieties. And one such anxiety that people have is the belief that they live in uniquely perilous times. It's nearly a constant throughout history that people believed they were living in end times, or some secular equivalent. Sometimes they were right to be concerned, but most of the time their fears were overblown. But by only focusing on what's happened since the year 2000, Saagar is either playing into this fear or he believes it himself. Probably the latter. But if we take a longer view of things, we see that Yang is right, and it's not even close. I know it's crazy to believe that Elizabeth Warren said something that's false, but believe it or not, she did. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I've talked about it several times before, but when it comes to pure numbers, automation has eliminated far more jobs than trade deals ever did. The decline in manufacturing jobs, both in terms of total numbers and as a percentage of the economy, predates the evil trade deals or permanent normalized trade relations with China. Every study I've seen sides with Yang and not Warren. The Brookings Institute estimates that about 85% of manufacturing job losses since 1980 were due to technology, not international trade. The Economic Policy Review estimates that about 75% of manufacturing jobs were lost to automation, and a study from Ball State University puts the number at about 90% over the same time period. So yeah, either Elizabeth Warren doesn't know what she's talking about, or she isn't telling the truth. Shocking, I know. It's particularly erroneous to set the starting point at 2000, given that so many of the cultural changes associated with deindustrialization started in the 1970s after the number of manufacturing jobs had peaked. This was when Bruce Springsteen and Neil Young and John Mellencamp started singing songs about how the working man had been left behind. This is also when we started to see a lot of anxiety about Japan and American culture. At the time, people believed that Japan was going to overtake the US economy, and that something had to be done to stop the devastation they had reaped upon our economy. Americans could no longer suffer the horrors of high-quality electronics and safer, more fuel-efficient vehicles being dumped on our shores. Japan's economy later slowed down, while America continued to grow. And now China has taken its place as the international boogeyman. Again, this is not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about China. It's just that things didn't start in the year 2000, and we need to have some perspective here. I should also note that it's not just automation that has changed the landscape of the US economy. Other technological changes, notably containerization, has made shipping costs way cheaper, allowing industry to take roots in places it previously had not. My buddy Sean from the channel Actual Justice Warrior made a video about this titled, Who Killed the Rust Belt? The link to it is in the description box below. I highly recommend you watch it. If you're not subscribed to Sean's channel, you really should. If you like my content, there's a good chance you'll like him as well. He points out that, interestingly enough, air conditioning played a huge role in jobs moving away from the Rust Belt.
You see, the South is hot. I don't know if you guys know that. A lot of deserts down south. Not the best place to open up a factory, because inside that factory, your workers would be boiling and very unproductive. But the Midwestern cities that we all associate manufacturing with are much more moderate in terms of temperature. It wasn't a coincidence or an act of God or luck that so many American car companies started in the Midwest and specifically in Detroit. Detroit had a climate that was conducive to manufacturing cars, and they had the water, the rivers, necessary to transport those products across the country. Now, because the Midwest had not only the temperature advantage, but the transportation of goods advantage, this led to another phenomenon that we associate with the Midwest, and that's unionization. You ever wonder why the heads of these major corporations that definitely did not want their workers to unionize for better wages didn't just pack up their factories and relocate somewhere else? Well, the answer is they literally could not pack up their factories and relocate somewhere else. They were in the ideal place, and anywhere else would have been more expensive than actually paying the workers the union wages that they demanded. So in reality, the so-called golden age for the American worker, the golden age for unions, when a union manufacturing job could pay a middle-class wage, had nothing to do with federal laws that were protectionist in nature. It had nothing to do with the lack of trade agreements with other countries. The factories had to be located there because there were no other options within the United States, much less without the United States, especially in the post-World War II era. But again, just like transportation costs were only half the story in the creation of the Midwest, there was another invention to offset the climate issue, and that invention was air conditioning. You couldn't manufacture things before in the much cheaper, non-unionized South because it was just too hot to do so. But all of a sudden, with the invention of air conditioning, you could have people working in air-conditioned factories anywhere in the country and be more comfortable than they ever would have been in the Midwest without that air conditioning.
The funny thing is, not only did the lack of air conditioning play a role in why jobs originally took root in the Rust Belt, I believe it's also why this region became a hotbed of swing states to begin with. As Sean pointed out, the inability to move jobs allowed for unionization, and unions have traditionally been aligned with the Democratic Party. Since the 1970s, and especially in the 1980s, the GOP explicitly became the party of traditional values and surreptitiously the party of white identity politics. Given that most union laborers in the Rust Belt were white and were also traditionalists, they became a large swing constituency. While their labor ties were to the Democratic Party, many of them became alienated watching the same party embrace the cultural left more and more. These people became known as the Reagan Democrats. They were economically on the left, but socially conservative. This is a constituency that both parties have been able to appeal to for different reasons, which makes where they live battleground territory in presidential elections, which makes this region particularly important to our national political discourse. Contrary to all the rhetoric about coastal elites, we see a lot of things through the eyes of the Rust Belt. This is part of why you hear so much about the deindustrialization of the Midwest, but you don't hear about the industrialization of the South or the Sun Belt, which happened at the same time. Now, going back to the issue of trade, no one would suggest that trade deals don't matter, or that there aren't any issues with them. I wouldn't talk about them as much as I do if I didn't think they mattered, and I have my own problems with them, specifically that they don't liberalize our economy enough to my liking. But when it comes to the shifting landscape of the American economy, they take a backseat to changes in technology. And yet, railing against evil corporate trade deals persists. It's not just Elizabeth Warren. Bernie Sanders is probably worse on this. And it's not just the Democrats. Donald Trump campaigned explicitly on protectionism. And before him, people like Rick Santorum championed a very similar agenda. So why does this mythology persist? Obviously, ignorance is part of the problem, but I don't think that's the most important factor. Politicians rail against trade deals because it's good politics, and it's good politics because people want it to be true. But why would people want it to be true? Well, it's not ultimately what they want, of course. If people had their way, they'd just have good jobs available to them at all times. But in the context of relative economic decline, people would rather believe that the less than ideal conditions they find themselves in are the product of conspiracy rather than technology. The rationale for this is simple, and it's one of the reasons why betrayal narratives are popular in general. It's much easier to stop a small cabal of villains, be they politicians, lobbyists, or billionaires, than it is to stop the momentum of innovation and technological change. Think about it. Almost all adults intuitively understand the inevitability of technological change. I'm only 30, and yet I'm old enough to appreciate how drastically our lives can change in a relatively short period of time thanks to innovation. I still remember when print media was ubiquitous, and when owning a newspaper was a surefire way to make money. Now, thanks to digital media, most local papers don't even exist anymore. I remember how much of a pain it was trying to catch a ride not too long ago. Now you can just use your phone to get a car to come to you. It's incredibly convenient, but it has come at a great cost to traditional cab drivers. I remember going to Blockbuster to rent movies on Friday nights. Now we just get almost all of our media digitally. By the way, on a side note, repurposed Blockbusters are some of my favorite stores. I could go on, and I'm sure that all of you can think of even more examples yourself. The thing about these changes is that we all kind of intuitively understand how and why they happened. Something better was offered thanks to innovation, and people organically started to change their ways. No one ordered these changes from on high. They all just gradually started to happen over time. So, however much you may lament the loss of mom-and-pop video stores or newspaper stands, you probably understand why they no longer exist, and that, in retrospect, their decline was inevitable. Even people who want to stop emerging technologies such as driverless vehicles in order to prevent the enormous disruption they'll bring about, understand full well the futility of trying to do so. Now, compare technological changes to trade deals. Trade deals like NAFTA or pacts like the WTO are necessarily negotiated behind closed doors and voted on through the political process. Sadly, we've decided that politicians should be able to dictate who you can and can't exchange goods and services with and on what terms. So, this is where we're at. Like any other policy changes, trade liberalization has benefits as well as drawbacks. Opportunistic politicians are happy to take credit for good things and blame their opponents for the bad things, and that approach seems to work well enough with the voting public. I would argue that most of our trade liberalization policies since World War II were actually adaptations and acknowledgments of the fact that we live in a global economy, more so than they were efforts to push that trend further along. But this doesn't stop politicians from promising to reverse the negative consequences, oftentimes playing into nostalgic memories of a past that only partly ever existed in the first place. Politicians like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump tell people that if you elect them and allow them to implement their agenda, they will restore these forgotten places to their former glory. And herein lies the appeal. Blaming trade deals for undesirable economic outcomes implies that these outcomes are the result of a small number of people making decisions, rather than these outcomes being the consequences of the nearly inevitable progression of technology, which is driven organically by society as a whole. You can elect politicians to repeal trade deals, but you can't roll the clock back on air conditioning. Saagar demonstrates exactly this wish thinking in his essay. This is bad news, but it's also good news. It means that we have a choice. It means that while automation can, will, and has remained a concern for our manufacturing base, through a radical shift in our trade policy, we can make a choice and bring some of it back. This is what candidates like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and yes, Donald Trump have talked about for years. I'm curious exactly what radical changes he's talking about. But regardless, believing that our current conditions were caused by incompetence, greed, and malice assumes that we have a level of control that we simply don't. You want your job back? Just elect the right candidate. If only it was that simple. I've lived in the Rust Belt my entire life. And for every political campaign I've ever been aware of, every politician, not just the presidential candidates, have campaigned on bringing the jobs back. Since the decline of the Rust Belt, we've seen periods of undivided government on both the state and federal levels. If bringing the jobs back was just a matter of policy decisions, why wouldn't politicians have done so? Trump has implemented protectionist policies, and yet we're currently in a manufacturing recession. Most Rust Belt states have actually lost manufacturing jobs since he's been elected. Alternatively, can you imagine the political capital that he or any other politician would have gained if they actually did restore the Rust Belt to its supposed former glory? Trump's re-election would be all but guaranteed. He or any other politicians haven't done so because they can't. Now, here's where our populist friends will interject and say, what about the corporate donors? First of all, it's not universally true that corporations want freer markets. In fact, I would argue that the majority want the opposite. Sure, Walmart thrives off the cheap plastic crap they get from China. But if you think US Steel doesn't want tariffs put on their foreign competitors' imports, then I have a bridge to sell you. Besides, what can politicians achieve by getting campaign cash? Well, they can't pocket the money. That will land you in prison. Just ask every governor of Illinois ever. You also can't pay people to vote for you. That is also illegal. The reason politicians solicit donations from people is so that they can pay campaign expenses such as advertisements and staffers to help them win. It's all a means to an end. You know what is a better means to the end of winning elections? Actually improving people's lives, especially the people in the states that matter. And if politicians could do that by bringing the jobs back, they already would have.
Improve people's lives, and they will vote for you, period.